Okay, this week we're looking at semantics acquisition. We're going to start with acquiring meaning, taking a look at some errors with meaning, and then some theories about how they're acquiring meaning. So, how they're mapping different pronunciations of words to different objects in the real world. So, the first thing we need to look at is this table. And this is a table of one child from 11 months to 19 months, taking a look at the different types of words that they seem to have acquired. So on this chart, we can see a list of nouns, which is overwhelming, and then we see some other words, so, expressions, adjectives, prepositions, and so on. But what we notice here is that there's a lot of nouns. And if we go through this list, we might notice that there are some nouns that appear earlier than others just based off their types. So taking a look at things like dog, duck, daddy, mama, teddy bear, very early on, these are probably very high frequency nouns that they encounter. I'm assuming there's a family dog, maybe there's a toy duck, the bat they're playing with. And as you go down, you'll notice that these are still common, but they start pointing at like inanimate objects. So car would be the first one, acquired a little bit later. And if we go down to diaper and toot toot and keys, uh, we're not seeing those in the first 5 words. And as we go down, we can still see that these are very high frequency nouns. What I find funny is in this other category where yuck is the first one that is acquired that is not a noun, and then hot, and then happy, and oops, and pee pee. We can see that these first words, these other words that they're getting, are probably more distress words than anything. So, how are children doing this in the first place? So, first of all, they're probably observing a lot more nouns in the real world because these are physical objects. So, it's probably easier to map objects to words rather than like events or relations. And it's been theorized very early that children do this thing called fast mapping. So, when they hear words and they look at objects, what they're doing is they're assigning a word to that object as like a partial placeholder. So, children can look at an object, give hear the word for it once or twice, and then acquire it. So basically, there's like an object here. They hear something. It's like a pig snout, for example. They call this a snout, and they'll just say, "Okay, this is the word for this. I don't really have a full representation of what's going on, but this is good enough for now, and we can fix it later." So this fast mapping thing happens at an early age, and of course, as adults, you might struggle with this a little bit more. So why nouns in the first place? So mothers tend to use more verbs than nouns when talking to children. So why is it that the nouns are acquired first? Well, two things. One is that verbs are more abstract and nouns are more concrete. But if we take a look at these types of questions that are being asked, we see that at the end of the sentence here, this, he, and then what do you want? This one's a little bit different. But if we take a look at all the different questions of this form that parents will ask their children, most of them end with nouns. Okay, so if we remember anything to do with spotlighting, then of course the words at the end are going to be acquired first. So that's interesting. But the bigger portion here that's important to look at is the question type. What? Who? What do you want? All of these prompt for nouns. So there's this integration where we're having spotlighting, where the last word is going to be picked up. So he or this, the child is paying attention to that word and knowing, like, okay, this is the object or person. And then we have a question that is asking the child to respond with a word to name that thing. Even for what do you want? Again, want is more abstract. It's a verb there, so they might not acquire want very quickly, but they're still being prompted with the word what for that noun. Okay. And then taking a look at the types of nouns that are used, words like cup, binky, daddy, bottle, these are all very simple and concrete objects. So this is not the abstract stage. This is not looking at like, oh, happiness or love or idea. These are very concrete things that the child is going to encounter over and over again. which makes sense. If you're trying to see if your child is picking up words or trying to teach them words, you're probably going to start with things that they're encountering and, saying, oh, do you know the word for this? Like, what is this? This thing that you use every single day that I say over and over again. Okay, so they could pick up some basic nouns. They're doing fast mapping. So the representations of what these are might not be completely accurate at this point, and they might underextend or overextend their meaning. So if you take a look at this and you are asked to pick out the dogs, you know which ones the dogs are. And for those of you who don't, is these three. I know this thing at the bottom right, it doesn't look like a dog, it's kind of ugly, but it is a dog. Okay, so underextending is when a child thinks that a specific word belongs to a very specific thing. So maybe this is their pet dog. They think this is dog, and the other ones that they see over here on the top right and bottom right, this does not get extended to dog. So it's being underextended. It's not covering the entire family of nouns that are dogs. While overextension is the other way. They might say, okay, well, a dog is anything with 4 legs. That might be their internal representation. So they take a look at these 3 dogs and this horse, and they're like, these are all dogs. Okay, and whether a word is underextended or overextended, this is not going to be consistent for all children. It really depends on what that internal representation is for each type of noun they're looking at. But there are definitely patterns. So these are some common properties of sounds that may cause overextension. So one example is size. And there's a couple examples on the right here. But if you think about size and these 2 fruits, apples and oranges, an apple and orange, they're about the same size. So they might see this thing that is round. Maybe they've experienced eating it before. And now suddenly they see this new thing on the right, this orange, and they notice, hey, look, this is for round, this is for eating. It's the same size, so I'm going to call this an apple as well. So that property, being round and eating, is causing this overextension. And about 30% of words that children produce, well, 1 in 30%, are overextended. So other things, other properties you might get are things like movement. So if we have something with 4 legs that moves, it might be a dog. If it has 4 legs and doesn't move, it might be a chair. Shape is a big one. So very similar with the apple example. It's round. You can eat it. So that might be an apple. If it's flat, maybe it's something else like a biscuit or bread or something like that. Sound is, of course, more auditory. They might hear like your pet dog growl, and they hear, okay, dogs growl. So then they go out and they hear like something that sounds like a growl. Maybe they go to a zoo, they hear some other animals making noises, and they're like, oh, those are growling too, so therefore they're dogs. Taste, of course, you know, with the word yucky that comes up, that they taste something. Maybe there's some food that they know the word for that they don't think tastes very good. Maybe they call that an apple. They eat something else that doesn't taste good, and they're like, "Oh, this is the same taste. It's gross. Therefore, it's an apple." Along those same lines of texture and function. So, function, I think, is the only one that is more abstract in this case, but this is like what you do with something. So, one example could be with sleeping. You put something over you when you go to sleep. It's like a blanket, right? So maybe anything else that you put over you when you go to sleep is also a blanket. So maybe someone puts a sheet over the baby and they're like, this is a blanket. No, it's a sheet. Or they put a stuffed animal on top of you to cover you and it's like, blanket. No, it's stuffed animal. So these are a bunch of different properties that can be reasons why a child might overextend. So remember, these are all just based off like very simple prototypes. So they're not encoding full information about all these different things that make something a dog or something an apple. They're just finding a few properties at first and then extending those to words that shouldn't have those labels. Okay. So correction happens surprisingly fast. So what might happen is a child learns, a lot like with the U-shaped learning and everything we've seen, understand that something has the proper word, like cat. Then they're learning these other words. They're like, oh, now I need to use properties in order to figure out what words are. So they get the properties of four legs and moving, and they call this a dog now. So they're using the word cat correctly. Now they're applying their prototypes and properties to get a mistake. Okay, but when a parent or someone else corrects that mistake, and they say, no, actually, that's not a dog, that is a cat, the correction happens very fast. So they would use the word cat from now on, and they would stop using the word dog for this object very, very fast. So it's a little bit different than rule-based systems with like morphology or phonetics, where you have representation, you have production, you have this grammar system in the background. These are all competing. These are just labels for words. So children can already acquire words very fast with fast mapping. Therefore, this correction makes a lot of sense how it can be fixed quite fast. They're basically saying, oh, this is a cat. Okay, the child is like, what makes this different? And now the properties are separated. Okay, so how might children acquire meanings for words in general? And there's two different theories that we'll take a look at that involve different aspects of word learning. So the first one is innate constraints. This was a little bit earlier than the other ones that we've seen, or that we will see, but there are basically three constraints that are used for word learning. One is called the whole object assumption. And that is when you see a new object and it's given a label, then this should refer to the whole thing. So you might have a situation where you see this object. I believe this is rhubarb. Don't make me look stupid, please. I don't see this in real life often. But a parent might refer to this as just like a stem. Like maybe they're just talking over the top. But the child doesn't know the word for the whole object. So they're going to assume that when they hear stem, they're not taking a look at the part of the object, they're taking a look at the whole thing. So they might start calling this whole thing a stem until corrected later. Okay, so that's one. Second one is called the mutual exclusivity assumption. So basically we're saying that objects have just one name. So if you know that this whole thing behind is a dog, and you see this object here, and a parent describes this as paw, then the child is going to think, hold on, I already have a word for the whole object, it's dog. This thing is not going to have two labels. Therefore, paw must mean something else. So it might be part of the object. So if the parent and child are both looking at this thing, they might understand that this bit here is a paw, or maybe they're taking a look at whole legs and assigning paw to that. But they're not going to assign paw to the whole object, the whole dog here, because they already have a word for it. Okay, the last one is the taxonomic assumption. And this is when you extend words. So this is when you have a bunch of things that are similar and you want to assign like a category label to it. So this is a pig. Let's say they know a dog, they know a cat. So they don't know what this is yet. They know dog, they know cat, and they're thinking, okay, I need to assign this a name. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the general properties of this. So things that look the same, that act the same. And first I'm going to assign this dog. Okay, so that's not a dog, that's a pig, but I will start with dog instead of labeling it something based off its properties. Like I'm not going to start and say, oh, it's associated in terms of fatness or thickness. I'm not going to call this fat or thick or pink. I'm going to call this the actual object, the thing that it looks like. And then when I have a bunch of these different creatures that look very similar, and I hear the word animal, when I finally assign this general meaning to all of these different creatures, I'm not taking a look at the specific properties of like color, or again, thickness. I'm taking a look at the properties that make them very similar. So the fact that they have 4 legs, maybe they have 2 legs or 7 legs, and that's integrated later. But for now, that 4-legged thing, they put them all together, and those are going to be animals. So they're not going to see a chair later. I can kind of draw a chair, very abstract, but they're not going to see a chair later, see 4 things, and then say that's an animal. Or they're not going to take a look at some circle out there that is also pink and then associate this with pig. They're going to take a look at the general properties that put all of these the same, that are not individual things like color or size, but rather movement or uh, the actions that they do. Okay, so those are innate constraints. And there was some testing that was done on these. Sorry, on this version, this should say 1988. On the full version, it does say 1988. So what happens in a picture selection task when children are asked to label specific things? So this tests a few different things. The first thing is this example of a cow and what the researcher will call a fendel. So if they're asked to find the fendel, children will overwhelmingly pick this object and not the cow if they're looking at 2 pictures. Why? Because children know what the cow is already. So when they hear a new word, they're saying, okay, the cow doesn't need another label. Words just have one label. Therefore, this new word must associate with this object that I don't know. So we get some support for the mutual exclusivity assumption there. Now, what about the whole object assumption? Okay, so they see this thing. They already know this is a fish. So when someone asks, show me the dorsal fin, the children don't respond by saying that the whole thing is the dorsal fin, but they pick some part of the fish. Now, we know based on the label in this diagram, or based on your knowledge of animal biology, that this is the dorsal fin, but children are probably not going to pick this out specifically. They might pick out like the head, they might pick out the tail, they might pick out the bottom part, maybe these colors, but they're picking something out that is not the whole object. So we get some support for this whole object assumption here, where, we know what the whole thing is, therefore this new word must not associate with the whole thing. Now, if we tie this back to overextension, there's an interesting thing that happens here. So let's think back to that child that for some reason is calling the cat a dog. Okay, they haven't been corrected yet. They just look at this cat, and in their mind, they think that these are both dogs. Okay, so they learned based off the thing on the left, and they extend it to the cat to call this a dog. So, logically speaking, based off what they call things, what would you expect a child to do if they're asked to pick out the dog in this picture? You would expect that because they call both of these things dogs, that it would be pretty evenly distributed. But that's not actually what happens. When children are asked to identify the dog in this picture, they pick the left one, the thing that they learned as a dog. Very, very often. We're talking like almost 100% of the time, they're picking the image on the left when they're asked to pick the dog, if that's what they learned it from. So they're extending the cat to call it a dog. But when they're asked to pick the dog, they're not going to pick that thing that they overextended. So that's just an interesting thing that kind of parallels what we've seen before. They're making mistakes in production when talking about other things. When you're testing their competence, what they actually know inside, they're picking the correct thing. It's just like the fish and fish phenomenon. When someone asks, is this your fish? And they say no, because they know in their mind that the word is fish. But their pronunciation is behind, so they're saying fish. Same kind of idea here. Okay. So Based on all this information and these innate constraints, you can see that these are very biased towards nouns. So Gentner introduced this thing called the natural partitions constraint or the natural partitions hypothesis and says that, okay, across all languages, there is a noun bias because we hear them more often and they're real and they're real concrete things. Okay, so based on what we saw in the innate constraints, this makes sense. It's noun biased. We hear a lot of nouns. Children in English acquire nouns earlier. Therefore, this makes sense. And if you take a look at a few different languages, you would find, yeah, this is true. These are all languages where we get more nouns than verbs. But there are languages out there where you get more verbs than nouns in a child's like bit of pronunciation. So when they're talking, so Korean, Japanese, Celtal, and there are other languages as well by different authors, but these are the first ones that Choi and Gopnik found. And this might be related a little bit to sentence structure, where you might be able to respond in a sentence with just a verb. Okay. And that is because also in these languages, we won't get into the syntax too much. But um, like I said, you can respond with just verbs. So if you want to say that you ate something in Japanese, like I don't know, did you eat the bread? You don't have to say I ate the bread. You don't have to say yes. What you can just do is you can just say ate. So the noun is essentially being dropped in this case. So all you're getting in the output is the verb. But it's implied that the noun is the thing that you ate in the question. Okay. So clearly these innate constraints that focus on nouns and pretty much only nouns are not going to cut it universally because it's not going to explain these other languages like Korean, Japanese, and Celtal where children are acquiring verbs first and more often. So from that came these things called developmental lexical principles. And there's 6 of these broken up into 2 different tiers. So the idea is that the first tier, the first 3 are acquired earlier, and the last 3, the second tier, are acquired a little bit later. So what we'll see is that the first tier is very similar to what we just saw, but it extends to actions. So first of all, the principle of reference would say that a new word that you get is either going to refer to a whole object, an action, or maybe even some sort of property. So these are accounting for adjectives as well. So maybe you see the word orange and you're like, okay, orange is either the entire thing, or it's what we're doing to this thing, or it's describing some sort of property of this thing. Okay, so that's the principle of reference. What is it referring to? The principle of extendability is what happens when you have labels for words already and you're trying to give a new label to these things and they're like, well, what is the whole category? So kind of how we think about with the principle of taxonomy and that extended part where you have a word like animal. So, okay, so I know this is apple, I know this is orange, now I hear the word fruit for both of these. So I'm going to be able to extend this and say, okay, these things are fruit together. Okay, and the last one shows a bit of an initial noun bias here, but in other languages, we can just pretend that this principle is a little bit weaker. So the idea is that when children hear words, they first assume that it goes to an object. So objects are prioritized over actions. But this doesn't mean that actions can't be acquired. It just means that objects are first preferred for word labels, and then actions can be acquired after. So they hear rhubarb, they're like, okay, this is the whole thing. It's an object. This is good. Like the principles, the requirements are satisfied. It's an object. It's a thing. It's a concrete thing. Therefore, it must be this. But then they might hear a word like sleep. And with the old principles, the innate constraints, we might be thinking, okay, this might be a little bit hard to explain, but this principle of object scope says, okay, well, the child is realizing that sleep is not an object. Therefore, because it's not an object, it must refer to something else. And it must be an action. Therefore, this action of laying down and closing her eyes and breathing is sleeping. So the principle of object scope just favors objects, but it doesn't say that everything has to be an object. It just says that objects are easier because they're real things. So children will think of that first. Okay, so that's the first tier. Now, as children age, they start to acquire these other lexical principles. So these are a little bit more complicated, but they kind of tell us how children hone in on certain word choices. So the first is the principle of conventionality. So this requires some bit of pragmatic understanding and social communication. So let's say this is a fire hydrant, and a child will say, this is a red pole, this is a red pole, this is a red pole. Well, when this principle is developed, a couple, 2 to 3 years later in life, they'll realize that no one else is calling this a red pole. They're all calling this a fire hydrant. Therefore, they adapt to the proper word due to conventionality. They notice no one else calls it that, so they will shift their talking. This is why in families you might get like very unique words for things that other people don't tend to use. Remember the course I was teaching, there were these cars that looked like trucks, and in his mind he called them like a truck. And that's what his family used. But of course, if other people did that in other families where that word isn't used, that word would have been abandoned pretty fast. Okay, the next one is the novel name nameless category principle. So this is when children are acquiring words for things, and maybe they're given a choice and they hear the word technology and they hear the word telescope. And they look at this thing. So the idea that would happen here is that the first thing that they would assume that happens is whatever word is given would refer to the specific thing. So the first is specific. And then if they get more words, like 2+ words, so in other words, let's say telescope comes first, and now this is also called technology. Now they assume that the technology must be superordinate. So what this basically means is if you think about the apple, orange, and fruit example, the first tier would be the specific things, and the second tier would be the things above it, like the higher level taxonomy that groups all these things together. So the first word they hear is for the object. If it's given another word, they would assume that second word goes to a higher level, but they're always naming individual things before they're naming categories. And finally, the last thing is the principle of categorical scope. And this just tells us that whenever you hear a new word or a new category word, it's going to be given to something that doesn't have a name yet. So you take a look at these two categories. So these two apples and oranges, you're given the word fruit. Okay. You know what these two things are. It's apple and orange. Therefore, fruit must be some category that you don't have a name for yet. Therefore, the things that these two are together is fruit. So you have that superordinate level. And now you're saying, okay, I have that level. I don't have a word for something yet. And I know the words for the objects. Therefore, this next word must be for the category. So principles of categorical scope and novel name nameless principle, they're very closely related. Okay, so there's some support for this. So one looked at Pulverman et al. These researchers looked at motion, path, and manner of verbs. So to give some background here, manner is how you do something. So this is like quickly, like when you dance or you move your arm. This tells you how you do something. Path is related to movement. So if I were to give some specific words for here, with path, I might think of like into, and for manner, I might think of like running. So if you say running into somewhere, you're giving both manner and path. Okay. So a lot of Spanish verbs do not actually encode motion into them. So what this would mean compared to English is that if you're asking children to acquire words for some of these properties, or you're giving them words and asking them, like, what is this new thing referring to? Spanish and English children should focus on different things. Spanish children should focus less on the motion than English children. And that's kind of what we see here. So when English children are given something, given a word for this, like let's call this dancing, and they're trying to assign this meaning to this word or try to find a general property, they're going to look at both the manner and the path here. They might focus a little bit more on manner because that's what we care about in verbs, and path is usually preposition. So English speaking children, let's say for the most part, they focus on manner. So when they talk about the dancing, they're talking about what they're doing. While a Spanish child, where they don't really encode manner and instead they encode more path into it, they'd be focusing on where they're moving, how they're moving, not how they're moving, but where they're moving, the path of the action. So when they say dancing, they might take a look more at the movement of how people are going, the direction they're going, rather than what they're doing. And that's what Pulverman found. They found that exact pattern where English-speaking children are focusing more on the manner when they encountered new verbs, and Spanish-speaking children focused more on the path. So this is just based on the statistical information that children are given when they're learning other words. They know, okay, English verbs, manner is important, Spanish verbs, path is more important. Okay, so that's from that aspect. Choi et al. In Korean, you might have heard about this already, but just know that the difference between English and Korean prepositions are how the meanings are represented. So English, you might just think of on as being a bunch of different things. It might be putting something on a flat surface. It might be putting something on a person. It might be combining two things together. It might be putting a lid on, putting something over your finger, or putting something on like a horizontal, or sorry, a vertical surface. Okay, so we have a lot of different options here. And these are all just on. Korean is different. So Korean would have different words depending on like the thing that you're putting something on, so the orientation. So if we're putting clothing on head, they have a different word than putting something on a horizontal surface versus putting something on like a vertical surface or what's calling juxtaposing surfaces. So the the aspect of onness for these prepositions are different. So if this is different between English and Korean, you would expect children to focus on different aspects when learning new words. So that's exactly what happens with English children. Putting on something, we're just talking about like a placement. They're just focusing on the placement. Is something going on something else? And I can say on in English because we know what that means. In Korean, children are not focused specifically on this general property, but more on specific things. So they're looking at is the fitting of clothing tight or loose? Is something going on a horizontal surface or is it going on a vertical surface? Is this clothing or not? So they're paying attention to different things here that match the requirements of their prepositions. Okay. So some of these, in a way, are support for the developmental principles. And some of these show some other things that need to be taken account for because these lexical principles, they're not really separating different children across different languages. They're not saying like, okay, Spanish children and English children focus on different aspects of verbs, and Korean and English children focus on different aspects of prepositions. So there's two more accounts for word learning here. One is called the social pragmatic account. And I think this is a very ambitious. But we say that children are guided by their understanding of what speakers are trying to say. So what this means is that when people talk, especially to children, they might use things like gesturing by pointing. They might look directly at something. They might make facial expressions at objects. So Children need to take all of that information into account to figure out what they're trying to label. So we have some joint attention here. We need children to be able to understand communicative intent. And as children grow older, we tend to notice that what they understand the speakers are trying to talk to, they use their gaze a little bit more as they grow older. So they might start focusing mainly on the pointing or looking at some object in between them, but as children grow older, they can focus more on like the gaze and they can make that connection of what the parent or what the other person is trying to reference. Okay, so with this information with joint attention and communicative intent, we might be able to explain some of the differences between languages here just based on the fact that they're looking at their parent and looking at gestures and looking at like specific aspects of words and focusing on different things. Okay, so there's a lot that goes on here. And in the questions, you'll see an experiment that may or may not support this account, very specifically referring to joint attention and communicative intent. So maybe this is a good explanation, but not the best. The other one is the attentional learning account. And I think there's a little bit more realism here, but let's still see how this works. So this is all about associative learning. And what this means is that when someone labels something, let's say this is a close race, we're learning the word race. When this word occurs, they must also see something at the same time. So there's a combination of what's called the stimulus, what they're seeing, and the word happening simultaneously. So they're making an association. And after this happens 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, the more it happens, the stronger that association becomes. Okay. So, I mean, this makes sense, right? I mean, if in order to name something, you probably have to see it and it has to occur simultaneously. So with basic words, it doesn't really seem like it's doing much. But this is huge for events and for actions. Because remember, we're preferring objects before we prefer these abstract things. So when you see the specific event happening over and over again, and you hear this word over and over again, you're going to see different instances of this event, but you're going to notice some patterns across all of these. Like, what are they doing? Oh, there's multiple people together. They're running. Maybe they're on a straight line. Therefore, okay, that's what a race is. When taking a look at prepositions in different languages, when children hears on, they're seeing it in a bunch of different situations. They're like, okay, this is just onness. Well, in Korean, when they hear a specific version of or specific word related to some aspect of on, like putting clothing on head, the only time they hear that word is going to be when that specific action is happening. So they're going to associate that onness with that word for on. Okay, so this cognitively is a lot more complicated because we say, okay, the child needs attention. So they need to be able to focus on the thing they're seeing and hear the word at the same time. They need memory over time for statistical learning. And these have to be carried together to different situations. So they have to remember the properties of these events and bring them over to different things that look similar but are not exactly the same, and then associate that word with that thing. So basically what we're saying here is that the children needs a bigger cognitive mechanism than just like a language faculty in order to do this associative learning. But this seems pretty good. There are experiments that show that maybe this isn't enough, but is a pretty good explanation for how children acquire events. Okay, one more thing, and that is learning verbs through a different method, through just syntax. And as I talk about this, I should remind us that although all of these theories are proposed as like individual things, they really do build on each other. So maybe there is some aspect of social pragmatics that is helping, maybe some aspect of attentional learning that's happening, and maybe some aspect of syntactic bootstrapping is happening as well. So we might not have a full theory that explains everything nicely with one account, but we have a bunch of different theories that can help explain certain parts or certain ideas. So the idea with syntactic bootstrapping is that we can use the structure of a sentence in order to help figure out verb meanings. Okay, so let's say that you see something happening with an object and you hear like object glorped. You see another object and you hear object glorped, and you hear another object and you hear object glorped. So what a child might infer is that at this point, glorped is occurring with different objects. So it's just like a one-person thing. It's a solo action. So they focus in on this one object. They see what it's doing as a solo action, and they're like, okay, based on what I see over and over again, I'm going to assign a meaning to glorped. So you might think of something like in English, like an actual word like slept, or usually jumped, or it's just I jumped, he jumped. In order to get the meaning of this, you're hearing that it occurs just with one thing, like, oh, mommy slept, daddy slept. So they're like, okay, this is an action you do by yourself. When I take a look at what's happening here, I know what daddy is, I know what mommy is, therefore was slept. Okay, they're closing their eyes, therefore this is the common thing that they're doing together. But they're using syntax in order to inform them of what type of action it is. So a more complicated pattern might be something like x glorped yz. So as an English sentence, you might think like I made him mad. So this is more complicated, but children might use this to know that there's some more complicated meaning behind it. They hear a subject, they hear an object, they hear some sort of change. They're at the stage where they can acquire these like individual and understand the pieces, but they don't quite understand the abstractness nature of glorped. But because they've heard so many other frames, they can just assume that glorped has something to do with causation here. Okay, so a more complicated example, but they might use this very complex structure to notice that this verb might mean something very abstract. And finally, this last example here with actors, usually if you have a verb sandwiched between two things, subject and object, you know there's a relationship between them. So there's an actor versus an actee, or an agent versus a theme, however you want to frame it, where when you say X flingled Y and you're trying to figure out what flingled means, you're probably taking a look at what X is doing to Y. So what X doing to Y? And based on what you see, you might assume that's what flingled means. So you're not looking at Y to see, you're not looking at the object to see what flingling means. You're looking at the subject. And based on what that subject is doing to that object, you would associate a meaning with that. Okay, so that is it for semantic acquisition at this point. I know that the online videos are probably a lot faster than lecture because there's a lot less tangents, no questions, and things like that. But these are all the different accounts of how we might learn words, some differences between children, and some explanations of overextension and underextension. If you have any questions, please come to office hours on Thursday, email me, Discord, whatever you like. And I'll see you in class for the workshop this week. Make sure that you read the experiment proposal example beforehand so we can go into critiquing it. And then the discussion questions will be part of the lecture review questions this week that will ask you about some of these theories with some new experiments.